relationships have a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a kind of life cycle to relationships. In the culture that we're in, we put a lot of emphasis on the beginnings. We put deliberateness into dating websites and the process of finding just the right person for us to be in, just the kind of relationship that we imagine in advance we want to be in. We put a lot of thought into how to begin relationships well. We put relatively little thought in how to end relationships well. We don't have an industry that's dedicated to ending relationships well and with integrity. But this is important because all relationships end. What do you mean, Steve? Not all relationships end. Well, they do. I used to teach these relationship workshops where I would ask all the participants to count the number of relationships that they'd been in, their own definition, whatever for them constituted a capital R relationship. And we'd sum up the number for everybody in the room. And then I'd ask who was currently in a relationship, and those people would raise their hands, and we would count the hands. And so we'd have two numbers, and we'd divide one by the other to find out the percentage of relationships that people in the room had been in that had ended. And that number was always somewhere around 90%. Now, the number is actually greater than that because some of those relationships, since the workshops happened some time ago, have ended since, and those that haven't will eventually. Even if people are together for their entire lives, someone eventually dies and the relationship ends. It's important to understand why and how they end, and this has to do with the steps or stages that relationships progress through in the middle. So understanding these stages is important in understanding why relationships end when they do, because it's often quite appropriate for relationships to end when they do. We tend to go around with this notion that it's bad when a relationship ends. It's a failure. It means something totally flopped. Instead of recognizing that relationships have their own life cycle, and relationships end at a time that's appropriate for them to end at, and it can be a beautiful ending. Let me say something about these stages, because what distinguishes each of these stages, dating, short-term relationships, medium-term relationships, and long-term relationships, is that there are certain kinds of hurdles that have to be crossed in order to move from one stage of a relationship into the next. And relationships end, some of them, at each of those stages. Dating is obvious. Everyone knows what dating is. It's a process of meeting people to find out whether or not you call it dating, whether there's somebody that you're interested in, and whether the interest is mutual. And for some people that includes finding out whether you're sexually compatible. And not everyone includes that in their process of dating, but for some people, do you enjoy sex together is a question that they have to answer as part of establishing mutual interest and compatibility. Not everybody makes it through this stage, but if you do, then you find out that you're interested enough to be in maybe a short-term relationship, which could go anywhere from a couple of months to a year. And in that short-term relationship, you find out the things that determine whether you make it across the threshold to a medium-term relationship. Like, for instance, are your styles compatible? Do you find that your ways of being with each other are matched well enough that you enjoy doing things together and going through the day-to-day experiences of life together? Related questions whether your communities mesh with one another. Do you fit into each other's ecology of relationships, your network of social relationships? And perhaps most important, do you still like each other? Are you still into each other once the novelty wears off? There's this kind of energy that new relationships have. People, in fact, call it new relationship energy. It's this kind of thrill or excitement that goes with the falling in love and the attraction that comes with meeting somebody new and getting deeper with them. It's a wonderful energy, and it always ends. So once that ends, is there enough substance to the relationship to keep it going? If the answers to all these questions are yes, then you progress to a medium-term relationship, which may be anywhere from a couple years to 5 or 6 years, depending on who you are. And you find out other things in the progression through those years that you can't possibly know in advance. For instance, can you survive a major conflict together? I don't just mean a fight, but a persistent conflict. Can you get through to the other side of a conflict in a way that has you come to understand each other better, which deepens intimacy, and makes the relationship stronger, instead of weakening the relationship so that you're always scrambling to try to overcome an unresolved conflict or destroying the relationship? Can you withstand conflict? Do you continue to meet each other's needs, interpersonal needs, in a substantial way over time? Do you really get your needs met by each other? Do you keep growing together? And there are a couple ways of growing that are important here. Do you keep growing as an individual? Does your partner keep growing as an individual? Or do you end up having to stunt your growth in order to keep the relationship viable? Does the relationship itself keep growing, or is that kind of faltering in order for your individual growths to occur in maybe a divergent sort of way? And Are your styles compatible in how you live together? Because for a lot of people at this time, they move in together and you have to find out, are you good living partners? Does it work well to be in the same space with each other? If again, the answers to all these questions is yes, thumbs up, then often that means you can progress into a long-term relationship. And long-term relationships can be long, 10 years, 20 years, it could be your entire life. And relationships still end in the long term because people change and people age and major life events occur, and it may be that a relationship does not progress through to the rest of your life. But to make it to the point where you are able to be together in the long term requires you to have gone through dating, short term, medium term, and then you get to long term. You can't actually skip any of these steps. People try to do this, but you can't. It's only with the passage of time that you find out answers to the questions that you need answers to progress across the threshold to the next stage. So if you get married early on in your relationship and you've never gone through a major conflict together, trust me, you will. It's inevitable. It happens in all relationships. And you won't know until you get through that first conflict whether you can survive a conflict and stay strong, or whether it destroys the relationship. And if you're already married, then you've got to split up because your relationship didn't survive. It's really useful to allow the relationship to progress through at its proper pace, because relationships happen in the present, not in the future. The process of deepening intimacy, getting to know each other, creating life together, it occurs in all of those stages, and it's good to enjoy the stage that you're in, and to not allow the fact that a relationship ends when it does to make you think that there was something wrong. For instance, you won't assume that you're going to be life partners with everybody that you date. It's the nature of dating. You're interested in some people and you're not interested in others, and that's okay. Some people make it through that screening process and some don't. It's the same for every other stage along the way. The hurdles that you have to pass through, some relationships make it through, some don't, and that's completely appropriate. There's no way you could have known until you got there whether it would make it or not. Once you get to the end of a relationship, if you assume that ending relationships is good because it's part of the natural life cycle of relationships, then you can say to each other, well, I love you, thank you for everything, it's time to move on, and let's find a way to do it as deliberately as possible. I recently reached the end of a 15-year relationship. And one of the things that we did to celebrate the 15 years that we'd spent together was we spent a month traveling together. It was kind of our vinegar moon. It's the inverse of a honeymoon. And we got to have that experience as a part of the process of completing our relationship. I'll talk more in depth about completing relationships in another video, but to suffice to say here that if you know that relationships end and it's part of the process, then you can do it in a way where you're not hard on yourself and hard on your partner, where you don't need to just divide and go your separate ways and never speak again, but you can find out how to have the kind of connection with each other that is appropriate to the time that you spent together and that honors it. So be in the stage that you're in and enjoy it for what it is.